Thank you for joining me for another Infinite Woman interview. I'm your host, Hannah Marshall, and today we're talking to Dr. MoNique, the Ancestrally Rooted Intuitive. Let me tell you about her. Dr. MoNique is a spiritual teacher, ritualist, healer, and business intuitive dedicated to helping healers, intuitives, spiritual coaches, and light workers embody the healing wisdom in their lineage. She helps her clients discover their ancestral medicine superpowers to create their unique healing system so they can serve more people, stand out, and earn more money. With her extensive training in metaphysical counseling and mentorship from her ancestrals and spiritual teachers worldwide, Dr. MoNique is a leading authority in the field of ancestral reverence. She's the founder of the Ancestrally Rooted Healers Academy and certification program. Welcome, Dr. MoNique. I'm so happy to have you here.
I am happy to be here with you. Thank you for the invitation.
Oh my gosh, my pleasure. Thank you for accepting. So I want to go way back. It sounds like you've been connecting with your ancestors since you were very young. Did you feel a connection to your ancestors when you were a child?
I did. And I think that connection really came from the fact that I really enjoyed being around the elders in the family and hearing their stories and hearing them talk about their experiences as children, hearing them talk about their parents and just sharing history with me. And through those stories, I felt a connection to their parents, to their aunts and uncles, to my lineage. But it wasn't until I got a little bit older that I realized that that connection was more than just me hearing the stories and feeling like I was getting to know them, but they were actually communicating with me. And over the years, that communication became more and more clear, right? There was much more clarity as I went on. And eventually, those ancestors started whispering messages in my ear. And through a series of events, that's how it all got started. So yes, as a young child. And then I think we talked before and I mentioned that my grandmothers were intuitives and one of my grandmothers was a healer. And so that opened up the communication and the being comfortable, right, with communicating with the spirit world. And that happened when I was very young.
Yeah, because I know when we talked before, you were telling me that this goes back generations, your mother, your grandmothers, and you showed me their pictures and they're behind you, correct? Yeah,
Yes.
those are the pictures of your grandmothers behind you. That's pretty amazing. So I'm curious, you said things happen through several events. Can you share several of those events? I'd love to hear.
Yeah. So one of those events happened when I was working in corporate America as a construction management engineer. And I received an offer for a job in the company that I was working for. And on paper, that job seemed like it was the perfect job, right? It was upward mobility, an opportunity to be seen, and more responsibility, more money. But when I went home, I told the hiring supervisor I would think about it because I always like to, kind of take that time to think. So I go home, go to bed in the middle of the night. This booming voice woke me up and said, "Don't take it."
Wow.
And I was like, wow, why would I not take something that looks so good on paper? Right. So I went back to work and I said, I'll take it. And so this job that was supposed to be 20 minutes from my home, that happened for, I don't know, maybe a few weeks, and then they moved it and it ended up being 40 minutes away, and then the next thing you know, it's like 50 minutes, and then it ends up being an hour and 20 minutes away from home. Right, because they kept moving it. And on my way to work, I would just feel like, is this all there is to life? Is this really what I'm supposed to be doing? And it gave me a lot of time to really think about my value, my goals, my soul purpose. Really, why am I here? Because I don't think this is it. I'm not enjoying the work and I am absolutely not enjoying this commute. I'm on the road for 2 hours and 40 minutes a day, right?
Yeah.
So one morning, early in the morning, I was on my way to work and it was still dark outside. Because I was on my way at about 5:30. I'm on my way to work and suddenly it became really foggy. It was so foggy that it was like somebody had taken pea soup and just thrown it over my windows. The windshield wipers weren't even clearing it off. I mean, nothing was clearing it. And it got so bad that I didn't know if I was in my lane, if I was over too far. And it became a very scary time when all of a sudden that same voice that told me don't take the job came through and said, roll the window down. So I'm like, okay, but it's foggy, it's cold, it's dark. Why would I roll the window down? I roll the window down and I can hear metal on metal hitting, right? And that's when the message said, pull over. Now, mind you, I didn't know if I was pulling over into a ditch on the side of the road, into somebody else's lane. I really wasn't completely sure, but I decided this time I was going to follow the guidance that I was being given. And I move over to the side of the road and I could still hear a few cars hitting. And then daylight started to come. The fog started lifting a little bit. And what I realized is that fog symbolized what was happening inside of me. I was so foggy about what I wanted to do and where I wanted to go. And I could literally feel the fog lifting outside and lifting in me and clarity coming. And I started realizing that this wasn't my destiny. This wasn't what I was supposed to be doing. I'm not enjoying the work I'm doing. Spending all this time on the road is not where I was supposed to be spending my time. And I started making a plan to leave. Not completely sure what I was going to do, right? Because this is when coaching, didn't know a thing about anybody talking about coaching or anything like that, because this was in the mid 90s. Mm-hmm. And so I'm kind of like, okay, I got to figure this out, when this opportunity came for me to become a trainer in the company. And I took on that position knowing that eventually they would downsize it because the company was downsizing and then I'd be able to leave. So I take on that position. And it was there that I started really discovering how much I loved personal growth, how much I loved coaching people, even though I didn't know it wasn't called coaching, but, counseling people, how much I loved it, how much I loved being in front of that classroom and seeing the transformations taking place. And then going through one of the programs that I eventually ended up being the leader of was really looking at what are your real values? And what I realized is that helping people and supporting people and happiness were some of my core values. And that wasn't being expressed as a construction management engineer. So I decided that, this was probably the direction that I needed to go. And I even started a mentoring coaching program for employees that were being downsized. And so that was one of the experiences that led me to really start to listen to the messages that I was receiving and to trust them, right? Mm-hmm. Trust them and follow them. Now, this position that I ended up getting, I could have had that position earlier and never ended up going to that other job because it was available. But by the time I had taken the other job, I wasn't even looking at it. So, sometimes we are taken down a path because it's leading us to something else. And sometimes we're on a path that's in the wrong direction and that path comes to an abrupt end and helps you to move on to something else. And that's pretty much what happened for me. So that was one of the experiences. And then the last one was visiting the grave sites of my enslaved ancestors. So actually going to the plantation where my ancestors were enslaved and walking around the grave sites. Now we had to climb up a steep hill to get to where the grave sites were. And we're walking along and we're feeling, all of us, I think, are feeling some sort of way about this experience and this connection. And I'm with my mom, my grandmother, and my aunts. And so, here we have 3 generations that are roaming around with these bodies underneath, our feet. And suddenly I fell into a hole.
Literally? You
literally fell into a hole.
Oh my God.
Fell into a hole. And at first I started to panic a little bit. And then I felt this calmness come over me that said, just be still. Just be still. So I was still for a moment and I felt this energy come through me. Now, mind you, falling into a hole, there could have been snakes in there, rodents, all kinds of things that I don't want to be around.
Yeah.
But I still stayed there for a moment until I was able to kind of climb out. Now, when I say whole, it wasn't like up to my hip. It was up to about, just below my knee. But
Mm-hmm.
still, that was deep enough for me to, and I didn't know if it was going to keep going or what.
Yeah.
But I felt this connection. And it was that night when we went back to our condo that I felt this overall sensation in my body that there were spiritual beings that wanted to communicate with me. And I needed to learn how to open myself to that communication. And so I just started calling up on my ancestors, asking them for advice, asking them for support, asking them to help me see and hear more deeply the messages that were coming through. I started connecting with spirit guides. And it was really that transformation, that time, that was the big transformation, because the experience with the job happened first. And then I would say it was probably 4 or 5 years later that I went to the actual plantation. And that's when I came back with this sense of purpose and knew that this was work that I'd want to do.
Wow.
So
Well, that's incredible. And when you said you fell into a hole, for some reason, I was thinking, was it an open grave? Like, were you, I was picturing this really big hole that you're like, help me. But I'm glad it wasn't that big of a hole. But I want to go back to the first experience for one sec, because I think it illustrates a couple of really amazing points. First of all, listening to that guidance and finally paying attention to it when you're like, nah, going la 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 la, and either not believing it's real or just thinking, nah, I'm not listening to you because this is what I feel is right. But then, God, the fog experience, I've been in that not too many times, but that is one of the scariest things, because you don't know what's going on. And it's so interesting that it was a symbol for you feeling like, I don't know what's going on. And thank God you were okay. I'm grateful that you were okay. And the job, I think that's a great example of what's meant for you. You cannot miss it. You can't miss it. It will come back, because I think people feel like that about opportunities, about their soulmate. And, Abraham Hicks, who I love, they'll always say, if you miss your ship, there's another one. If you miss that ship, there's another one. So it's amazing that job that you could have had before came back around.
yes.
Now, your ancestors, that's amazing. That experience, I'm having chills right now as you were sharing it, as I'm talking about it. And what I think is so amazing is that you reach this point of honoring them and going, I need to listen and consult with them, because there are other cultures that do that regularly. It's part of their culture, like the Native Americans and a lot of Asians. They're always consulting with their ancestors. And I think the majority of people, I don't want to generalize, but it seems like America's like, whatever, unless they're really spiritual and making a conscious connection with the ancestors. And they're just kind of floating along on the surface trying to figure things out when there's so much help available. So I don't even need to ask you how you got into it, because you just told us how you got into it. So it's amazing. And you know what I've noticed? There's so many engineers that end up becoming coaches and getting into personal development and the spiritual end of things and combining them. And I think that's an amazing thing, because, there's a methodical mind. So I think they're excellent coaches, because they're going to figure out how to help their clients. And I know that that's what you're doing. So those are pretty amazing experiences. Do you have any other ones?
Oh, yeah, there's plenty of them,
Okay, give us one more. Give us one more.
That when my grandmother, both of my grandmothers were very, very intuitive, as I mentioned, and both of them lost their mothers at a very young age. And one of the stories that I work with in my work, because I focus on, instead of, people talk about ancestral wounds and curses, I call them stories. They're stories that our ancestors have lived, that have been passed down to us, and now are impacting how we make decisions. And one of these stories is abandonment. And my grandmothers experienced abandonment at a very early age, the deaths of their mothers, as well as their fathers, who were military men, who at that time, you didn't have, you weren't single male raising kids and serving in the military. It just wasn't something that was going to happen. So both of my mothers my grandmothers, excuse me, ended up in orphanages. And their experiences with abandonment, while they played out very differently for each one of them, for both of them, it still was a core story wound that was experienced in my family. And I saw it on both sides of my family and how it was playing out. And I realized that I needed to do something to shift that and change that story. Now, for me, abandonment didn't play a huge part in my life because both of my parents, my parents were married until my father died. So they were married for 50 years, spent most of my mother's adult life was with my dad. So they were around, they were there for me, they supported me. Abandonment wasn't an issue in terms of me not experiencing my parents being there. What I found is that sometimes I would abandon my goals. Right? I'd get started and then I'd come up with something else and I would do something else. And I couldn't understand why I would lose that focus sometimes, or I would focus so hard on it that I would miss the signs that it wasn't the direction that I needed to go because I was trying to avoid abandoning. I didn't call it that at the time, but I was trying to avoid giving up on my goals. And when it hit me that my grandmothers had experienced this abandonment and that my mother and father had also experienced abandonment from their fathers, I realized that abandonment was a core story that was happening in my family. And I needed to do some work to release that story, to really help my ancestors who felt abandoned, who were abandoned, help them no longer carry that wound, that burden, that story. Mm-hmm. And I noticed that in my family, that abandonment had been passed down for generations because my grandmothers had experienced this. Ancestrally, when we look at history, with enslaved ancestors, there was abandonment that took place there as well. So that abandonment stories that played out for multiple generations, and then it gets to my parents and both of their fathers were not in their lives. I realized that I needed and wanted to do something different. Just because I wasn't personally experiencing it the way they had, I was finding that I was holding on to that story in a way that wasn't advancing my life in the way I wanted to advance. And I went about connecting with the ancestors, and it really helped me to develop the system that I use now to help my clients release the stories that are showing up in their families as well. And I call it the ancestral story healing system, where I connect with the ancestors and create this healing system for them and really reconcile the ancestors and help them overcome the things that they experienced. So now it becomes lighter and it lifts for us as well.
Wow. And I'm going to ask you about the work that you do and how you do it and who you work with and all that kind of thing. But I wanted to say also that I'm so interested in this because it's something that I never took a deep dive into. And I think it's so amazing and helpful and healing to think about it like we can help heal our ancestors and they can help heal us depending on what their experience was, how it relates to our experience. Because I know I've told you about my great grandfather, Willis Marshall. He was a psychic, a scholar, a healer. I'm a late baby. My parents were much older, so my grandparents were much older. And so you can imagine my great grandfather, I think he was born in, I can't remember, like mid 1800s. And he was an author. I have a couple of his manuscripts. But I remember when I was little, my grandmother told me, she described how he predicted the 1906 San Francisco earthquake and fire. And she said, oh, and he put his hand on his forehead and said, there's going to be a terrible fire and a terrible earthquake. And when I started doing research on him a few years ago, I found some magazine articles and they had quotes from people who were there when he made his prediction, and actually said he put his hand to his forehead, so it kind of blows my mind. And then I felt connected to him because he was not only a scholar, which it's not opposite of spiritual, but usually somebody's one or the other, but the fact that he was a psychic and a healer, I didn't know he was a healer. I feel like that's where I get it from. So, and I found out my dad was very spiritual after he died based on things that I found of his, and he never talked about it. It made me kind of sad that we didn't connect about that. He couldn't express that. But in my own research, and I haven't taken too much of a deep dive, but I haven't found what would seem like a lot of ancestral wounds. I mean, your history, that's a whole other level of ancestral wounds with slavery and that kind of thing. I can only imagine how that trickles down to subsequent generations and how it affects them. But even though I haven't found stuff like that, I'm sure it's there. But after we talked the very first time, I was looking at it like, okay, I'm going to call on Willis more to help me and guide me, because I feel like, all right, you passed this down to me and help me utilize it to the best of my ability. And it just made me feel supported. So I want to thank you for that confirmation when we talked before, and just kind of piquing my interest in this. But now I want to talk about your work. So I know you work mostly with other professionals, but I wanted to ask you, can you communicate with a client's ancestors for them, or do you teach them how to communicate themselves, or both?
When I initially started my work, it was me doing the communicating. I was connecting with the ancestors. And then as time has gone on, I started teaching others how to connect with their ancestors, because I believe it's important that we have that connection on our own. And sometimes it's just like when we go to someone who does spiritual readings, we may be able to do our own, but sometimes we kind of get in the way. We want to hear the message a certain way, so we're missing things. And then we go to someone else and they add clarity to what we were already kind of feeling, experiencing, and what our intuition and soul was telling us. Well, that's really what is happening with my work. Initially, it was really doing those readings and connecting with those ancestors and sharing the stories for the client. Now I'm teaching the client how to do it on their own. And that's when I really shifted and said, I really want to go back to what I always enjoyed doing. And that was being a spiritual teacher, is teaching people. And I realize now that the ancestors took me on this journey of learning ancestral communication, of learning how to do ancestral healing, and now journeying into helping people really uncover what their ancestral medicine is, similar to what you talked about in learning about your grandfather, was your great-grandfather, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, learning more about him. Well, each of us has ancestors that had gifts, and these gifts are passed down from generation to generation to generation. And then in some instances, some generations didn't really take on the gift, didn't take on the medicine, didn't utilize the medicine. So it became weaker and weaker. But we can like reactivate that medicine, and I can help the client now take that wisdom and knowledge that is in their blood and bones and turn it into something that they can offer their clients. So we start with the communication, we work with the healing and looking at different wounds that someone may have. Some, like I said, some of them are historical, some of them are things that have happened in the family. I help them identify where some of them show up. There's 8 that I work with, but sometimes people only have 1 or 2, right? And some of them, sometimes people have all 8. And then once we do that, then we're looking at, what is that medicine and how can you use that now to help other people? Whether it's in a professional setting where you are now a healer or a coach or a spiritual entrepreneur, or you're leading an organization, or you're just doing work in your community and you want to help the community, or you want to help your family. We take that medicine and really create a blueprint for how that's going to be used for people. One of the other things that often comes up is people feel that the only reason to communicate with the ancestors is because the ancestors are wounded. Mm-hmm. And I'm here to tell you, there are more ancestors that are healthy, healed, and whole, and ready to love you and support you and guide you than there are wounded ones. Because most of the ones that are carrying the wounds and the stories that are disempowering are ones who kind of got stuck. They may have died suddenly. They may have died with a lot of anger. They may have died with a lot of hurt, and they haven't, for whatever reason, taken that journey to become ascended ancestors. But the majority of our ancestors do become ascended. They do look back over their lives and identify where they could have done better or differently and how they want to be of service to their descendants. And that is what they're there for, to provide us with support and guidance. It is a joy that they have. It is a pleasure that they get. And it is a part of their soul contract as well to carry on and to do the work that helps us. And that's what makes it so beautiful when we establish that connection, which is why a lot of people say, well, why don't we start with the healing first? And I'm like, well, we can start with the healing first, but that communication and connection is where the real beauty comes from. That's where the real transformation comes from. And by connecting with these healthy ancestors and communicating with them and channeling their messages, it makes it so much easier for us to heal anything that needs to be healed that may be showing up in our lives now. And it's interesting because when I talk about these karmic stories are not necessarily stories that someone may be experiencing in the same way that their ancestors did. So one of the stories is scarcity. Mm. You may have an ancestor that had love withheld, or wasn't in a supportive environment, or didn't have a lot of love from the people around them, maybe didn't have a lot of opportunity. You may have an ancestor that had money challenges. There may be ancestors that went through a famine or something that created a lack of food for them, or, a period of the Great Depression. Any of those things where there was a lack of something, your ancestors may have experienced. And then it comes to you, and although you may have a flow of money coming in, maybe how you're utilizing that money is questionable. Maybe it comes in and then it's gone, right? Or maybe you're having a hard time attracting clients, or maybe you're having a hard time how to charge for something. So there's different ways that it shows up. It may not necessarily be that you have money problems in the same way that maybe an ancestor did, but they still play out in different ways. They play out in how we make our decisions. So those are how the stories come. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and as you're saying this, my family went through the Depression. My parents were children. So my grandparents were in the thick of it. And also my grandfather was my dad was in World War II. My grandfather was in World War I. My great grandfather was in the Civil War. So there's all this stuff that they had to deal with. But I always called my mom a Depression era pack rat because she never wanted to throw anything away. She's like, we might need that one day. So they were taught to hold on to everything and recycle and repurpose and reuse it. And I get that. But when there's a whole room full of crap, then that's then we're moving beyond that. But it's just so interesting because now I'm like, my wheels are turning because I've been aware of it. But now it makes me want to go examine, like, how did that trickle down to me? So that's really fascinating. And I love the spectrum of people that you can help, from individuals who can just heal their own family issues or lineage or anything, or make them aware of something like, oh, maybe this is where that came from, to the professionals that you mentioned, to even people in corporations and helping the people who work for these companies, because this applies to, we all have ancestors. So this applies to everybody. So it's incredibly valuable, and it's so interesting. I think people would be fascinated by it, like, ooh, let me dive into my ancestral stuff. So I know you've talked about, I want to hear about ancestral story healing. And also I want you to tell us about ancestral medicine. I want you to get into your program, but I'm interested in these two things. So let's start with, what is ancestral story healing? Or did you kind of already cover that?
I covered it a little bit, but we can definitely talk about it a little bit more. For most of us, somewhere in our lineage, our ancestors were connecting with the spirit world at some point. I know in, African culture, that is very common. Even today, our ancestral reverence is really big in many African, ethnic groups and societies. That is very important. Well, it's the same for, as you mentioned, for other communities as well. But if we really go back and look, we'll find even more evidence that our ancestors were having that communication. And so sometimes when people are saying, oh, well, I'm not sure about connecting with my ancestors, I'm like, well, your ancestors were sure about it. They sure were, right? Would you like me to tell you about one? And I usually can connect with one that was doing that kind of communication. So ancestral story healing is taking a look at the 8 karmic stories that I work with. Now, there are many more karmic stories, but these are the 8 that I find no matter where people are located in the world, one or all of these, some or all of these 8 are showing up. And these 8 impact multiple areas of our lives. So the 8 are abandonment, abuse, anger, betrayal, fear, grief, shame, and scarcity. So those 8 are the ones that show up in the lives of everyone that I work with. Some are more pronounced than others. Some are creating more blocks than others, but they're all pretty much playing out in some way. And what I do is I identify, when I'm working with a client, I identify which of the karmic stories are impacting a person's life right now. How is it impacting their life? How is it holding them back? How is it preventing them from getting where they want to go? And then what I do is I connect with the ancestor where that story originated. And I just ask that ancestor to come forward. Sometimes that ancestor needs some work. Sometimes that ancestor, and here's the interesting thing, sometimes it is not necessarily that the ancestor is wounded and is trying to harm you or has passed something negative to you. Sometimes they're protecting you, right?
Wow. Ooh.
So for instance, if you have ancestors that were healers and somewhere down the line they were abused for their work, they were betrayed, they were abandoned, maybe even killed, fear was created, grief was created. If that ancestor experienced that, so imagine what happens when you say, I'm going to be a healer, right?
Mm-hmm.
All of a sudden, this ancestor wants to protect you, wants to keep you from experiencing the same experience that they had. And they will do things that will oftentimes keep you from being able to expand your work or attract clients or really have that deep transformation with your clients. Or they will do things where you're constantly learning all these different healing modalities, but never doing anything with it. And that's when it's unconsciously playing in the background of your life, right? Mm-hmm. And this ancestor is helping to protect you. So when that ancestor comes through and I'm noticing that that's what the ancestor is doing, then I can have a communication with that ancestor along with the ancestors that want to help, right? And support. I can have that conversation and we can release that ancestor. So now the ancestor becomes an ascended ancestor and is ready to help instead of block.
Wow.
Right? Is ready to help, is ready to form a partnership with us and help us get our work out into the world. Mm-hmm. And as healers, when healers call upon their ancestors that were healers and ask them to come forward, that transformation is so amazing and intense, and it's fast and it's quick and easy. And I mean, to the point where the healer is like, did I really do that? Right? Did we really have that happen? And I've seen it happen in my own work, healing work. And I've seen it with the clients that I work with. And that's how ancestral story healing works. And now I'm teaching other people how to have that same level of communication with the ancestors so that they can communicate with their clients' ancestors and identify where these stories have originated and then work with those ancestors to heal those stories. Wow, so that's ancestral story healing.
That's fascinating. I love that. Oh my God. Okay, so now tell us, what is ancestral medicine?
Yes. Ancestral medicine is sort of a piece. Well, I'll go back and say the ancestors every few years give me something new, right? They're always kind of mixing it up. And it was me starting out with, just communicating with them. Then it was, okay, we want to teach you how to work and connect and heal and identify, the things that are going on in a person's lineage. And then it was a few years ago, it was really connecting with the women in our lineage, our ancestresses, having that deep connection with them because they had messages and still do that are very powerful. A lot of my work was really wrapped around connecting with the women in our lineage, the grandmothers, which is why I have my altar there that is dedicated to the grandmothers. I have other altars too, but that one is specifically the grandmothers. And then they led me into ancestral medicine. And how that kind of came about is I started noticing as I'm working with healers and coaches that they were continuously doing a lot of learning and learning new things and not really applying it. I noticed that healers were learning these healing modalities, but then they were kind of offering them, but weren't really offering them. And they were somewhat confused. They weren't quite sure what they wanted to do. And then I started noticing that people were just didn't have any clarity about what it was that they wanted to offer, but they knew deep down inside there was something there. And I said to the ancestors, what is it that we can do to help? And they said ancestral medicine. Them really discovering what has been passed down to you that you can use as the gift that you offer other people. And I was like, oh, okay. And they said, like your gift, you have a gift of communicating with the ancestors. You have a gift of being able to share stories, and not just the wounds, but the stories. So when I'm sharing the stories, not focused on just the things that have caused pain, but you have a gift for sharing the stories. It is something that has been passed down for multiple generations. And as I started studying and doing genealogy research, that in fact, that book right there is a part of it that my mom and my aunt did. It's 10 years of research. Started learning about my ancestors, started learning about where my people came from and what part of Africa they came from and what were some of the cultural traditions and things that they experienced. That's when I started realizing, yes, this has been passed down. And then as I started working with my clients who were in that space of, I really don't know exactly what I want to offer, or I've been doing this, but I want to do something different. And I said, well, let's discover this ancestral medicine that the ancestors keep telling me that, I'm going to be doing the work and doing this. So I didn't pick up on that right away. They kept telling me, and I was like, okay. So I started working with my clients, and we started looking at what has been passed down throughout your lineage by intuitively, going in, talking to the ancestors, channeling those messages, what has been passed down. And then we find what it is. And then I look at everything that they've been working on. I look at the things that they really enjoy doing and the things that they don't enjoy doing. And then we come up with their unique system for offering something to their clients. So it's the unique thing that they offer. It's something part of their lineage, part of all the things that they've learned since they've been in this physical life. And we create something that is very magical and powerful, and it becomes their real superpower. And that's the ancestral medicine piece.
Oh my God, that is so fascinating. Like, I want to do that. So
It's fun. It's
fun. Oh my God, just hearing about, I'm thinking about stuff while you're talking about this, and it's just so amazing and so interesting, and can expand somebody personally, professionally, and in their business and with their clients. And oh my God, I hope everybody gets in touch with you, because this is for everybody. This is for everybody.
It really is. It really is life-changing. I've worked with a woman who's offering grief support in corporations, right? Who ever thought?
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
I'm not saying she's not a counselor. She's going in and teaching,
Yeah.
right? Teaching
It,
people
that applies for sure. And I
to,
think more of
right?
this, if more of this was offered in corporate America, I think it would really help people. More emotional support, more types of emotional support,
Yes,
alternative support, instead of just, if it was part of HR, that would be great. So
right.
hopefully that's becoming more and more prominent. And I'm just happy to hear that you are making headway in those areas. So I think that's fascinating. And hopefully there's some people seeing this, maybe that are in corporate America, like, hey, let me incorporate that. But I just have to say, I'm sure that your ancestors are so proud of you and so grateful that you're carrying on this gift and sharing it with so many people, because this really is, it's truly fascinating. And I'm so glad that you figured out your gift, because you are expanding that exponentially and helping so many other people find their gifts. And I want people to connect with you, and anyone interested, anyone can reach out to you, right? And do this work with you. And so they can find all your information on your website, correct? drmonique.com, correct?
Yes, they can go to drmonique.com. We're actually in the process of doing some updating there that will reflect the new program that we're rolling out in October, which I'm excited
Exciting.
about. It's Ancestrally Rooted Intuitive Certification Program that really brings all of this work together. Everything comes together and people learn how to communicate and channel their ancestral wisdom, as well as the healing part, and then discovering their medicine. So we're bringing it all together for not just business owners, but like we said, leaders in corporations, as well as people who just really want to do this work within their families or their communities.
Yeah.
And really looking at it in ways that they can really blend it in with what they're already doing. Like in a corporate environment, there's different ways that you have, that you bring it in. You don't walk through the door and go, hey, I'm a certified ancestral intuitive. That may not go over too well. I mean, you could.
You
Hey,
can.
I would love would we get to the point where that would happen and everybody would say, oh yeah, I get that. But we aren't there yet. So we look at different ways that you bring it forward. And the beautiful part of this program, the thing that I love about it, is that it isn't something where you have to follow a certain protocol.
Mm.
It is unique to each person that goes through the program. How they utilize the information, how they utilize the things that I teach is very individual. And it is based on what that person feels called to do.
Wow.
So we don't have that, completely on the website yet, but you can reach me there. And there's all kinds of freebies on there that people can download and learn more as we get ready to roll this program out in October.
Oh my God, so exciting. And yes, your website is beautiful, and there is a ton of information, and it's going to be right here. And you have a free gift for the viewers, do you not?
Yes, I do. I sure do.
Tell
So
us.
if people are wanting to get started with those 8 karmic stories that I talked about and really beginning to identify where they're showing up in the family, some of them you'll be able to go, okay, that one, that one, that one. And some of them you'll say, well, I don't know if that's showing up. Well, you'll be able to go through a series of steps that helps you identify which of the 8 karmic stories are actually in your family lineage. And then there'll be some bonuses that will help you to start to heal and release and what I call deactivate those stories in your DNA.
Yeah,
So there's some information in there. And so it's a real way to get started.
that's perfect. That's a perfect thing for anybody who is just, maybe this is new to them and they could just kind of dip their toe in it and see. And it's the first step to taking a deep dive with you as well. So it's here on the website. All the links will be in the description below. And we'll have all of your contact information there. And And I'm so grateful for you sharing all of these stories and your expertise and your experience and what you do. This has just been so incredibly fascinating. So thank you, Dr. MoNique. Thank you so much for joining me and sharing this journey and how we can all benefit from connecting with our ancestors for healing on so many levels.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for having me here. I always enjoy talking to you. You have
Oh,
such an amazing spirit. And just like our first conversation, this was just absolutely wonderful to connect with you
oh,
and to
thank you. Well,
share.
I
So thank
agree.
you.
Thank you. And you are amazing. And I'm so happy that we are connected here and that I can share you with everybody. So thank you for letting me share you and your story. And thank you for watching and joining me today. I'll be back with more inspiring interviews with amazing women. So remember to subscribe here on YouTube. And if you'd like to join the community and get free resources to support your self-care, jump over to my website, tanamarshall.com, and take the self-care boundary quiz and find out how well you prioritize your self-care and sign up to be notified about upcoming events and programs. Thanks so much for joining me. I'll see you next time.